End. Please be seated.
Yes, Ms. Finnis.
Thank you, Your Honour. I call BAB.
Sorry?
BAB.
Will you take an oath on the Bible or an affirmation?
Affirmation.
Would you, excuse me, I'm sorry. Would you repeat after me? I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give in this Royal Commission
the evidence I shall give in this Royal Commission
shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Yes, thank you. Take a seat.
Thank you.
There's some water there if you'd like.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
You're known by the pseudonym BAB for the purposes of the Royal Commission,
That's correct.
and you made a statement dated the 12th of May,
I did.
and you have that with you.
I do.
Are the contents of that statement true and correct?
They are.
It'll be Exhibit 2814.
Thank you, Your Honour. I invite you to read your statement, sir.
Thank you. This statement made by me accurately sets out the evidence that I am prepared to give to the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. The statement is true and correct to the best of my knowledge and belief. I was born in 1964. I am currently 50 years old. I come from a large Catholic family in Ballarat East. I was one of 8 children. When I was growing up, Ballarat East felt like it was its own community within Ballarat. There were a number of prominent Catholic families in Ballarat East, and my family was one of them. Generally, these prominent families took up the first 5 or so pews in the St. Alepius Church, East Ballarat, and our family had its own unofficial pew. My parents were both quite active within the church community. Ever since I was a young kid, we often had Christian brothers and parish priests come to our place on Sundays for lunch. I started school at St. Alepius Kindergarten in Ballarat East. This was a co-ed school run by the nuns. I stayed there until I was in grade 2. In 1973, when I was in grade 3, I moved to St. Alepius Primary School in Ballarat East, which was an all-boys school run by the Christian Brothers. I was 8 years old. My grade 3 teacher was Brother Gerald Leo Fitzgerald. Brother Fitzgerald was a very strict teacher who often used violence to punish kids who did not obey the rules. We were a fearful class. Brother Fitzgerald was a very strict teacher who often used violence to punish kids front or down the back. I saw boys in my class sitting on Brother Fitzgerald's knee, and I saw him fondling and kissing them. I think many of the boys in the class would have seen this. At first, Brother Fitzgerald seemed to randomly choose boys to come up the front. After a while, I noticed that Brother Fitzgerald picked favourites. By this I mean he used to choose the same boy to sit frequently on his nap over a few weeks. After this, he chose another favourite, and the pattern seemed to continue. Brother Fitzgerald often asked the kids he chose to sit on his knee to stay in the classroom with him at playtime. My classmates and I sometimes spoke about the fact that a kid had been asked to stay behind, but we never discussed what this might have meant. In about autumn 1973, Brother Fitzgerald picked me to go and sit on his knee, but we never discussed what this might have meant. In about autumn, he said to me, "Can you stay? Would you like to come to the boiler room and see the elephant bones?" There was a rumour in the class that Brother Fitzgerald had these fantastic elephant bones in the boiler room. We all wanted to see them. The boiler room at St. Alepius was like a cellar. It was down a flight of stone steps off to one side of the classrooms. It had a padlocked steel gate on it. The room was very, very small and cramped. It was also very dark. There was just one light on the wall. There were boilers in there to keep the heating going. When we got into the boiler room, I started looking round for the elephant bones. Brother Fitzgerald was pressed up behind me. He then told me that I needed to air myself. This is something Brother Fitzgerald would make the whole class do 4 or 5 times a week. It meant taking our pants off and standing there in our underwear. When Brother Fitzgerald told me I had to air myself, I took my pants down, as this is what I had been conditioned to do. I then felt Brother Fitzgerald put one hand on the back of my neck and push me forward. He slid down my underwear. I felt something enter my anus 3 times. I don't know whether it was his fingers or his penis. He then told me to stand up and pull my pants up again. Immediately after that, Brother Fitzgerald told me that I was never allowed to say anything about what had happened. At that time, I also felt that it was not in my own interests to actually tell anyone about the abuse. I'd already seen Brother Fitzgerald lose his temper a few times in class with students. If students did not obey the rules he had set down, he generally responded with violence. Mostly we either got the gat, which was a steel rod wrapped in leather, a fist to the side of the head, or an open slap across the face. I thought this would happen to me if I told anyone about what had happened. I also began to feel quite a lot of shame build up over the weeks that followed. It wasn't something that I wanted anybody else to actually know about. After the incident in the boiler room, things went sort of back to normal in the classroom. About 4 days later, while our class was doing work, Brother Fitzgerald called me to come and sit on his knee. I refused. I said no. After that, I started to get physical abuse from Brother Fitzgerald. It seemed to me that at any opportunity for any sort of infraction, Brother Fitzgerald would take me to the front of class and give me the strap for no particular reason. For instance, one time we had a maths test. Because maths was not my strong point, I got 9 out of 10 wrong. I was taken up the front and Brother Fitzgerald stood behind me. I was made to call out the answers I put for each of the sums, and for every wrong answer, he punched the side of my face. Another time during winter, Brother Fitzgerald asked us to write something one morning, and a couple of the kids complained about having cold, cramped hands. Brother Fitzgerald asked who had cold hands, and of course, I put my hand up, having just ridden my bike to school. I was the only one that was taken up the front and given 12 of the best across the hand to warm it up. This meant 12 straps across the open palm of my hand. There were lots of similar incidents. At this time, Brother Fitzgerald was picking on 4 or 5 other boys in the class in the same way. Like me, they were physically punished frequently for no particular reason. The assaults gradually lessened after time, and towards the end of the year, I was ignored by Brother Fitzgerald. But when those assaults were happening to me, I knew why. I was able to make the connection between the punishments and me saying no to going up and sitting on his knee, and potentially being taken down into the boiler room again. After Brother Fitzgerald abused me, he turned up at our house another 4 or 5 times. He used to ride his bike out. Sometimes he had a drink with my father, other times he had lunch with my family. I felt intimidated by the fact that Brother Fitzgerald could turn up at my home. I felt as though, even when I was away from school, he still had me in his grasp. He could still turn up and intimidate me in my own home. I also became aware that there were other boys who were being asked during class to stay in the classroom with Brother Fitzgerald at playtime. During playtime, I could see into the classroom. I could see that boys were being kept in by 1 or more brothers. Based on my own experience, I assumed these boys were not saying no, because it was always the same boys who were chosen. I suspected that those boys were being sexually abused. 2 boys in particular who seemed vulnerable were frequently asked to stay back in the classroom. I noticed they seemed to be having a difficult time of it through the year. I have struggled for a long time with the idea that at that time, although it sounds callous and heartless, I felt that it was much better it happened to them than me. When I was in about grade 5, I noticed that some kids in other classes were also staying back in the classrooms at playtime with certain brothers. As I was going to the playground, I sometimes saw boys sitting on the knees of brothers or being spoken to by brothers. Because of this, I became consciously aware that it was going on to not only kids in the grades below me, but kids in my grade and kids in the next grade. For the rest of my time at St. Alypius, I was never once assaulted or approached or molested in any way. I began to think that I was not getting picked on by other brothers because I had said no in grade 3. About 3 months after the event in the boiler room, we had a visiting priest come to St. Alypius to hear confession. I don't recall this priest's name, but I thought this would be my opportunity to actually talk about this and to say what had happened. During the confession, the priest asked me, "And what are your sins?" The first thing I said was, "Well, Brother Fitzgerald has done things to me." I remember there was silence for about 30 seconds, and then the priest said, "That didn't happen." When he said that, I realised that was going to be the position, and there was no point in me telling anyone else. I felt disappointed and sad that nothing was going to happen about it, and that those other boys would still be taken out by Brother Fitzgerald. From grade 3 until grade 6, I was an altar boy, as were most of the boys at my school. As an altar boy, I helped the parish priest and visiting priests at St. Alypius Catholic Church. I was often an altar boy to Father George Powell, who was our parish priest at the time. Father Powell also came round to our family home quite a lot over the next few years. There were many, many opportunities for me to tell Father Powell what Brother Fitzgerald had done to me, but I never did. I can't explain why. I stopped being an altar boy when I left St. Alypius in grade 6. I went to St. Patrick's College in Ballarat from Form 1 until Form 4. St. Patrick's was also run by the Christian Brothers. After Form 4, I told my parents that I wasn't going back to St. Patrick's. I went to a non-Catholic school instead. I did this because I could see the hypocrisy in the Catholic Church, even though I did not have the words to describe it that way at the time. It was obvious to me that to preach one thing and to do another and expect people to take that was not good. I never reported this matter to the police. After I became aware that Brother Fitzgerald was deceased, I really didn't see that there would be any point. I did not tell my parents about the abuse at the time because they were such an integral part of the Catholic community. We were a time-honoured Catholic Ballarat East family. I didn't want to shake my parents' faith, and I didn't want to devastate them. I didn't want them to know that they had put me in a position where this sort of thing could happen, even though I know now that they had no role in that. My father has since passed away, but I still haven't told my mother, mainly because I think there is still that element of being a victim and that shameful aspect that goes along with it. She is elderly, and I would not want to shake her faith. I think that once my mother has passed away, I will have conversations with my siblings. It took me another 30 years after I told the priest in confessional to be able to tell anyone else about the abuse. After I had been married for about 10 years, my wife realised I was having an issue and she asked me, "Why have you got this trouble?" I just sort of blurted out to her what had happened. My wife was quite shocked when I told her. After we talked about it, however, she could understand the reasons I had not told anyone earlier. We have kept it a secret from our families ever since. About 3 years ago, my wife could see that the abuse I experienced as a child was starting to affect our relationship. She persuaded me to seek counselling, which I did for the first time. I started getting counselling at the Centre Against Sexual Assault, CASA, in Ballarat. CASA later referred me to a psychologist in Ballarat, who I now see. I think that my actions of holding on to this internally have actually led to a psychological barrier, which now means that my marriage is almost collapsing. I think it's become more debilitating the longer it's gone on. I've withdrawn more, and it is to a point where it is really affecting my relationship with my wife. A few years ago, a counsellor at CASA told me that the Catholic Church had a process in place for victims to seek compensation, called Towards Healing. I had not heard about this process before. At the time, however, I decided not to go through this process or seek compensation. Looking back, I think there must have been a lot of adults in Ballarat East who knew what was going on at St Alepius for a long time. I believe this because it affected so many kids, and I think so many kids must have seen what was happening. I do not understand why it was allowed to continue for as long as it did. I would like the Catholic Church to officially recognise the child sexual abuse and officially apologise for it. There are a lot of people who are hurting and who deserve an apology. I would also like Cardinal George Pell to publicly acknowledge that child sexual abuse was committed by clergy and brothers under his watch as the parish priest in Ballarat East. I would like him to apologise for this.
No questions.
Does anyone else have any questions? No, thank you, Mr. BAB. Thank you for your statement, and you're now excused. Yes.
I call David Ridsdale.
Mr. Ridsdale, will you take an oath on the Bible or an affirmation?
Affirmation.
Affirmation. Would you repeat after me? I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give in this Royal Commission
that the evidence I shall give in this Royal Commission
shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Yes, thank you. Take a seat. Yes, Mr. Nick.
Tell the Royal Commission your full name.
My full name is David James Ridsdale.
Made a statement dated the 15th of May.
That's correct.
The contents of that true and correct?
That's correct.
I tender that statement.
For the Exhibit 2815.
My name is David Ridsdale. I was born in 1966. I'm currently 48 years of age. I grew up one of 9 children in a large Catholic family in Ballarat. As others have expressed, my family was a key member of the community. Both my parents are from large families, and there are around 50 grandchildren on my father's side of the family. The religion of my parents was an all-invasive force in our lives, with every aspect centred on the Catholic community. My mother was secretary of St Alepius Parish School and was involved in the school for over 50 years. My parents remained committed members of St Alepius Parish. My grandparents lived opposite the Redan Church, and my grandmother was like a mother to all the priests who resided there. As a young child, I enjoyed the liturgy and believed what the church taught. The church taught me that priests were something more than human with a direct link to God. They were incapable of sin. In my experience, the church had narrow parameters of sexuality and gender, and to fall outside those boundaries was a sin. The church dictated the boundaries of right and wrong, and the congregation's relationship to the clergy was one of submission rather than supplication. My uncle, my father's oldest brother, is Gerald Ridsdale. He was a Catholic priest in the Diocese of Ballarat. Gerald was treated like a shining light on my father's side of the family, particularly by my father's mother. I believe he represented the pinnacle of her Catholic achievement. As a priest, Gerald held, I'd just like to explain, I'm choosing to call by his first name, due to that we share the same last name. As a priest, Gerald held an almost supernatural level of power in our family and exerted a great deal of control over the family. He was treated as being better than his siblings and took full advantage of his exalted status. Gerald was charismatic and many were in awe of him. When Gerald came home to visit my grandmother, she would be extremely frantic. For example, hours before he was due to arrive, all of my father's 6 other siblings had to get their cars off the driveway. Everything had to be prepared for Gerald to smoothly drive in. My father has told me that as a child they used to call Gerald the God Botherer because he was a pious and horrible brother who lorded himself over his siblings in a superior fashion. St. Alepius. In 1971, I started kindergarten at St. Alepius Girls Primary School, which was co-ed school up to grade 2. Gerald was a priest at St. Alepius for part of this time. I remained at St. Alepius Girls Primary School until grade 2. In 1974, I went to St. Alepius Boys Primary School for grade 3. My grade 3 teacher was Brother Gerald Leo Fitzgerald. Every Friday at the end of school, Brother Fitzgerald lined up our class and we all had to kiss him goodbye, or potentially be strapped. Some kids got special kisses, meaning he used his tongue. This happened to me a couple of times and I would see him linger with other boys. Sometimes Brother Fitzgerald singled out some of us to stay after class or come on his weekend bike rides. I went on a few bike rides with him. We would ride into the bush and countryside where Fitzgerald would teach us about the outdoors. He was both grumpy and affectionate, and at the time his lewd behaviour was not obvious. But with the benefit of hindsight, I can see the inappropriateness of his physical closeness. On one occasion, when I was aged 9 or 10 and in grade 4 or 5, I had to go to the sick bay. Brother Best was there. He was never my year teacher. He'd move very close to my body and touch me between my legs. He kept saying, "What's wrong with you?" I was scared and began to cry. He then relented. As I think back to this period in my life, I recall other similar incidents. I now realise I have ignored or excused other incidents in light of Gerald's action upon me. The best incident went into the growing pile of not as bad things that happened to me growing up. At the end of grade 5, the St. Alepius Primary School closed and we were reintegrated into the girls' school. I went to this school for grade 6 in 1977. I started to misbehave at this time and my parents put it down to the reintegration of the school, but this was not the case. When I was around 9 or 10, Gerald started to hang around my family home. He gave my family gifts and offered trips away for our large family, which obviously was rare. I remember one trip to Apollo Bay where we were invited to his place. My family had never been to Apollo Bay before this time. My mother fell pregnant with my younger sister when I was aged about 11, and it was a difficult pregnancy. Gerald began asking to help and offered to take me away for weekends on the preface of easing the burden. I was a pious young man and often suspect my mum was earmarking me for the priesthood. I think Gerald took advantage of this and used it as a means of getting greater access and time with me under the guise of preparing me. Gerald first sexually abused me on one of the school holidays when I was 11 years old and in grade 6. We were in a car on a parishioner's farm near Eden Hope where he was teaching me to drive. He stopped the car, undid my pants and began to pull my penis out to play with it. My naivety was so great at that point that I genuinely had no idea what was happening. I thought he'd broken my penis when the white stuff came out, as my ignorance of my body was so great. After this, Gerald took every opportunity to initiate sexual interaction with me. He mainly abused me during school holidays or on weekends. Initially it was masturbation, and then kissing, and then oral sex. I remember the first time we were in the bush somewhere and he tried to make me perform oral sex and I gagged. He used to get angry if I couldn't perform the way he wanted. He never fully anally penetrated me despite trying many times. One year, Gerald took me and 3 other boys to White Cliffs. I now know that 3 of us were molested by Gerald. One of the boys, who was a friend of mine, eventually told me that he had seen Gerald being over-friendly with me one time. Later, when we were about 17, he told me Gerald had tried to seduce him on that trip. He told me he backed away as he realised what was going on. My cousin was also present with his father. My cousin and I are convinced that his father was suspicious of Gerald and as such did not let his children alone with him. Sadly, my cousin's father died before taking any action. In 1980, Gerald was sent to Elsternwick in Victoria for a year, supposedly to study. In Elsternwick, he lived with other clergy. He used to take me and other boys to stay with him there. There was no effort to conceal us, and we would meet the other students in the common room before heading to his room. One time, there was myself and another boy sleeping in separate beds. Gerald would move between us from bed to bed in the same room. On another occasion, Gerald was at my grandparents' house with a boy who had been living with him while he was a priest in Mortlake. Gerald told me the boy was living with him while his parents were going through a divorce. I remember that while we were at my grandparents' house, he stood the boy on the table, was giving him Eskimo kisses and kissing him inappropriately in front of members of the family present. I cannot recall exactly who was there, but it was more than just my immediate family. I remember being disturbed that nobody said anything. I remember as my parents were driving home from my grandparents' house, someone commented that his behaviour with the boy was weird. Nothing else was ever said. On another occasion, when I was 13 or 14, my younger brother and I were walking out of the house just as Gerald was driving up to the driveway. Gerald pulled me into an embrace and kissed me on the lips in a sexual manner. My younger brother saw Gerald kiss me passionately. That same brother has told me years later that Gerald tried to kiss him in a similar way, but he pushed away and told him to bugger off. Gerald sexually abused me on a regular basis until 1982, when I was 15. I was abused in a variety of cities in Victoria and New South Wales, including Edenhope, Ballarat, Apollo Bay, Inglewood, Mortlake, Elsternwick, St Kilda, Whitecliffs, Mildura, Horsham and Wilcannia. I stopped counting after that. Gerald was not secretive about his love for boys or in having boys around or touching us. He would use his power and prestige as a priest to convince children and adults to trust him. When Gerald started paying more attention to our family, he began buying gifts for my parents. One I remember was a colour TV. It was the first colour TV we ever owned. Much later, my father said, I always wondered why he was so nice to us. I think one of my parents' biggest issues looking back is realising Gerald groomed them to get to me. St Patrick's. In 1978, I went to St Pat's College in Ballarat for high school. I stayed there until year 11. I experienced physical abuse there, but not sexual abuse. The school was run by the same Christian brother order that ran St Alepius. The teaching method was always firm, and the fairness depended on the brother you had to deal with. I don't know of any kids at St Pat's specifically who were abused there, but there were rumours from the boarders about some teachers. One example was a rumour of the music teacher who liked to get his baton and flick it in your penis because he thought it was funny, and then asked if you wanted it massaged. Another brother at the school once put his hands on either side of my head and got very close and intimate. I now perceive what he was doing was making a pass. At the time, I stood on his foot and told him to back off. He asked my name, and when I told him, he replied, "Oh, you are one of those Ridsdales." At the time, I thought it was because my older brother had been a difficult student and I had always followed in his shadow. But looking back, I truly wonder what it meant. I remember another teacher whose classroom had to be soundproof due to the noise he made when he would fly into a rage in the class. He was the Form 5 and 6 maths teacher and a leading Christian brother in Victoria and Tasmania. I would often see his violence and aggression surface when he was angry On one occasion in Form 5, he decided I hadn't answered a question correctly and threw my yearly notebook across the room, causing the pages to fall out. I questioned his action because I felt his reaction was uncalled for, and that turned into a huge verbal row. The next day, the headmaster called my parents, and although they listened to my side of the story, they said that such a respected mathematician and Christian brother could not be wrong, and therefore I was lying. I was given detention. Once again, I was reminded that religious clergy were more important than the rest of us and could get away with anything. For me, St. Patrick's became a painful place to attend because I felt different to the other students. Disclosing. It was a long time before I knew I was being sexually abused. I just didn't know at the time. After abusing me, I was left alone with feelings and ideas I did not understand, with no one to talk to. The church was a leader in the social idea that gender and sexuality was a simple binary choice. In my experience, if a male did not present heterosexual traits, he was prone to ridicule and isolation. I felt I was completely alone and unable to tell any adult what was happening, especially as I started to struggle with my own sexuality. After Gerald started abusing me, my behaviour at home became unruly. I was prone to aggressive emotional tantrums and was extremely sensitive about any perceived transgressions on my part. I don't think my family made the connection, as I'd always been rather sensitive and different from my brothers. Gerald took advantage of this. My parents did not know what was happening on those weekends away with Gerald, but looking back, I realised some incidents should have been clues. For instance, one occasion, Gerald dropped me home. He told my parents they should check me for genital lice. He said I must have gotten it from his bed. I'm a parent now, and if it was me back then, I would have been asking, what was my son doing in your bed? I know there was no maliciousness on the part of my parents. I am sure if my parents had any inkling of what he was truly doing, they would not have been silent. My father has since said that if he had known at the time, it might be him in jail today. From the age of 15, I told a close family member on at least 5 occasions I'd been abused by Gerald. The 5th time, I bluntly said, Gerald has been molesting me. Rather than respond to my comment, the family member said, I hope one of your sisters will return to the church one day. It was as if they did not hear what I had said. Growing up, I was too afraid to talk what had happened to me. I didn't tell anyone until I was 15. As a teenager, I lived in terror that my growing sexual feelings were indicative that I had a predatory nature like Gerald. The church had done an excellent job of convincing not only me, but my whole family that sexual deviation was a terrible sin. To like someone of the same sex was a mortal sin and something a good Catholic could not do. I was too terrified to even consider the feelings I was having. My only sexual experience and education had been at the hands of Gerald, and I equated my growing inner feelings with his actions. It took many years to relieve myself of that disinformation. My reaction to the church was to lose respect and trust in it. I began to question everything and lost faith in the church. This caused huge problems with my parents as they wanted me to stay in the church and couldn't understand my animosity. I lost faith in all institutions and have held an individual worldview since. The sexual education I received at both school and church was almost non-existent. This left me feeling vulnerable and completely ill-prepared for understanding my sexuality, and therefore I had no capacity to understand what Gerald was doing was so wrong. When I was about 16 or 17, I began telling my peers about the abuse. I'd been working with people of my age in youth and social programs at the YMCA, and issues of abuse had been raised, which triggered memories and a new understanding of what had happened to me. I began to confide in my fellow volunteers, and almost without fail, all of them said that some form of abuse had happened to them. At the time, I had a perception that this was a normal part of society. I had kept my sanity through my teen years, through youth leadership at the YMCA, and through that program I had achieved national recognition. To compensate my horrible life, I threw myself into any project, to the point that at the age of 22 I was burnt out. I had been working 80 hours a week in full-time school as a psychiatric nurse. I thought I was trying to build a life, but what I was doing was hiding from reality. I left Ballarat for Melbourne and began a wide range of jobs, including music management, fruit picking, etc. I returned to nursing initially part-time to pay the bills before working at a private hospital. It was some time before I realised sexual abuse was not a part of most people's upbringing. Another response I would receive from adults around me that anyone who committed such acts should be killed, and anyone who was abused as a child was bound to repeat the cycle. This was the type of ignorance within society at the time about such issues. When I was about 20, I first wrote to Gerald expressing my disgust at what he had done to me. I never kept a copy of that letter and received no reply. The confusion inside me led to make many mistakes in my late teens, but I was determined not to follow in his path. At one point I rang a police number but was too scared and hung up the phone. When I was 21, I wrote another letter to Gerald, which I showed my elder sister before she sent it, actually. I again expressed my rage at how Gerald had manipulated me. I again received no response. Even though I had begun to tell family members and people around me, there was no strong encouragement to tell authorities or bring it to the attention of others. I was continuously told it was my decision to report it, but also reminded of the damage it may cause my family and the church. In 92 or 93, I began running a support group for Christian brothers who had been accused of child sexual abuse. I did this for some months. It was before I came out publicly. Gerald was in jail at this time, so my surname was associated with him. The supervising psychologist where I worked was fully aware of my circumstances and that although I shared the same surname as a convicted offender, I was one of his survivors rather than a relative. In retrospect, I am unsure of the professionality of that event. Up to that point, I told siblings and friends. One of the main reasons that held me back from telling others is that I did not want to hurt my grandmother. Her love and obsession of her son Gerald was undeniable. I loved my grandmother and was terrified that if Gerald's behaviour was public, it would kill her. The growing distress within me was too great and I needed to act. Not long after going public about my abuse, my grandmother became very ill. She was soon bedridden and then died. I never got the chance to speak with her again. When I was 25, my former partner and I were expecting our second child. I began having terrible feelings and dreams. My main fear was that I would turn into my uncle. I started feeling I was being abused all over again. It all became too much, and we decided something had to be done as it was negatively impacting my growing family. I did not know what to do. I was terrified of ringing the police. I was terrified to go public. I decided to ring George Pell. And I will only refer to him as George Pell. I have known George since I was born. He was a family friend. He used to attend church services and activities when he was an assistant parish priest at St. Alepius. We continued to see him even when he was headmaster at St. Aquinas Teachers College and School. Pell was an avid swimmer. I would often see him at either Eureka Stockade or YMCA pools. I have called him George from since I was a child. I have never recalled calling him chose to phone George on that day for one reason. He was the only human being in the church who I believed was still I could trust. At 9 a.m. on the 2nd of February 1993, I rang George from my home in Bentley. My partner at the time was sitting in the room when I made the call. I told George I had been abused by Gerald. His first reaction was, "Oh, right." His tone came to relatively quick, and I could. His reaction was, "Oh, right." His tone came to relatively quick. I had been clearly concerned for my grandmother and was seeking access. Pain and distress was overwhelming. Then my take care of their needs. Things such as have to buy a car or the last 3 lines. "Excuse me, George, what the f*** are you talking about?" I said, "I want to make to keep you quiet." And my response was, and everything stand for. I hung up the phone. As soon as I hung up the phone, I called my elder sister and told her about my conversation. I also called my second elder sister and told her about the conversation. I remember saying to both my sisters, "The bastard just tried to bribe me." I have never stated that anything specific or tangible in our conversation. To direct the conversation down a particular path made me extreme. Anything specific or tangible in our conversation. George was the first person in the Catholic Church whom I officially told about my abuse by Gerald. In 1994, while I was still working at the private psychiatric hospital in Brighton, run by the St John of God nuns, I saw George Pelsons the first time since our conversation. George came to me and said, "Oh, David, how are you going?" He did not ask if I was all right, or if I needed help, or if he could do anything to help me. He had plenty of opportunity to call me and help me, but he never did. In the mid-90s, I saw George Pell again at a Ballarat forum after Towards Healing was introduced. The forum was supposed to provide an overview of the Church's response to the historical abuse. Pell seemed surprised the attendees did not believe the Church had been unaware of the conduct of its clergy. I called him a liar there, but I was actually the quiet one compared to some of the other individuals present. I recall one man said he wanted to kill Pell and the other attendees had to calm him down. I now understand this same man has committed suicide. Some days I don't know who I'm angrier at. And that never stops. Gerald for being a sick monster, or George for the way he reacted and dealt with the issue. Catholic clergy are meant to be the moral leaders of our society, but after my reactions from George in the Catholic Church, I have zero respect for him and that institution. After I spoke to my sisters, I was furious at George's response and I decided to call the police. I rang the Bentley police station and they said someone would return my call shortly. Half an hour later, the police returned my call and said, "Are you aware your uncle was to be charged later today?" I said no. Later that day, the police picked me up and took me to the police station for an interview that lasted many hours. I was told the charges to be laid against Gerald were going to be delayed for 24 hours so they could use my statement as well. The police told me I had to be ultra-specific about every instance of sexual abuse that I included in my statement. The police told me I had to be ultra-specific about every instance of sexual abuse that I included in my statement. So my initial statement contained with indecently insulting myself and several other boys from Eden Hope. I hadn't been aware that Gerald had abused other kids at Eden Hope, but was not surprised. As the case drew nearer, the police asked me whether I would agreed to drop the charges Gerald refused to plead guilty to. The reasoning for this was that I was told to avoid the need to give evidence at a trial and that Gerald could be sentenced and jailed as soon as possible so they could release his name to gather more evidence against him. I agreed to drop half the charges against Gerald, and as a result, he was only charged with the more minor offences against me. Gerald was convicted and sentenced for sexually assaulting 8 boys, including me, on the 27th of May 1993. He was sentenced to 2 years, 3 months imprisonment, and he served 3 months. Initially, I was extremely upset at the brevity of the sentence and worried it was all going to be brushed under the carpet. My trust in institution and authorities was shaken after this. Throughout the gruelling process, the police were very good. They told me they feared there were many more victims of Gerald out there. They told me if I helped them by going public, they would make sure Gerald never got out of jail. They felt that a public face to what had been happening would encourage others to come forward. The police said straight up, "We can't do this without you." That was their promise, and they have kept it so far. After the first criminal proceedings against Gerald ended, I did an interview with the Herald Sun. I expected a few people to come forward. As a result, maybe a dozen. From feedback I received from the police and the support group Broken Rights, up to 200 victims of child sexual abuse came forward after the article was published. There were many more victims of Gerald that came forward than I could have possibly imagined. In 1995, I did an interview with Who magazine. At that time, I referred to George Pell as a trusted priest. In April 1997, I told Outrage magazine the trusted priest was George Pell. In 2001, I was interviewed for the 60 Minutes program. When this program was released, there was a letter in the paper from a man who said he knew I was a liar. His reasoning was that no human being would dare swear at a bishop who holds such high regard in society. The bishop he referred to was Pell. I wrote a letter to this man and told him why I did what I did. He wrote back to me and said, "I have been sitting here crying for the last 4 hours. I am so sorry." In 2012, or maybe even later, recently, 60 Minutes re-aired this program. I didn't know they were going to do this, as nobody told me. I now know they told nobody. I only found out about the re-airing after my family rang me. Every time I have spoken out, there has been some backlash from the church, often from Pell. They would criticise me for inconsistencies with dates which they attributed to me lying, rather than consider the sloppy journalism at fault. The reason I say it was sloppy journalism, because every time I said I called the police the day before he was charged, they wanted to know the date. I said, "I don't know, find out." The fact they didn't do their job properly is not my concern. The Diocese of Ballarat paid for 7 sessions of counselling for me after the criminal proceedings. I just did not feel that was enough. I started civil proceedings against the Catholic Church in 1993. I was not offered any more counselling. Soon after commencing proceedings, I was told by my parents that Bishop Mulcairns, who was bishop at the time, held a meeting with my parents and encouraged them to drop the case, to get me to drop the case. The meeting was held without my knowledge. My parents told me that Bishop Mulcairns refused to acknowledge any inappropriate conduct on the part of Gerald. The church made me an offer of $10,000 to resolve the proceedings. My lawyers, Williams, Winter and Higgs, advised me if I did not accept the $10,000 offer, I would be dragged through a court case that I would never win, not in a million years. They went on to advise me I would end up with a $60,000 to $100,000 bill which would destroy my family and my life forever. At that time, I was a terrified 25-year-old with absolutely no support from anyone. I rejected the offer. The church made a second offer of $30,000. I begrudgingly accepted this offer after I was made to feel scared and convinced the church's legal status as a non-corporate entity meant they could not be legally challenged. At no point did the church ever say words to the effect of "how can we help?" I think that could have made a big difference in my life. When my extended family first found out that I was abused by Gerald, some of them called me a liar and said, no, none of that really happened. One of my cousins refused to believe Gerald had ever done such a thing and called me a liar. Other members shrugged off my story and said, oh, you know, David, he's emotional and sensitive. Other family members have accused me of being a gold digger, or that it was so long in the past I should have moved on by now. I know most of these responses are due to ignorance in understanding abuse and its long-term insidious impact. My grandmother's funeral was one of the last major family events I've been to on my father's side of the family. My family have difficulty talking to me about the abuse, Gerald, or the church's involvement. It's too painful for them to think about. As I ask too many questions, I am unable to keep my head buried in the sand. My mother is still a devout Catholic and cannot understand why none of her children go to church anymore. She thinks it's a failure on her part. My daughter asks me, why does Nanny go to church? Does she not know how much it hurts you? I try to explain to my daughter that my parents grew up in a different era and that my mother genuinely believes that hell is a real place. I've never told my mother that it hurts me, that she still goes to the same church, St. Alypius, but it does. My cousin, who was also abused by Gerald, told me he was told by some family members that if he ever took money or compensation from the church for the molestation, anything he ever bought with it would remind him of this abuse. One of my aunts still visits Gerald in jail. She claims she does it in honour of her mother. I don't think my grandmother would agree. With the church being such an integral part of my family's life, the fallout from revelling, my grandmother would agree. With the church being such a understanding of the impact of abuse and the shame of Gerald makes it painful for them to discuss it. This inadvertently making me feel more alone to deal with the damage it has caused me. I have become adept at hiding my pain and creating a strong persona, as I don't like letting the bastards win. My family's involvement in moving Gerald. At his funeral, one of my aunts said to me, I've known for so long. I replied, sorry, what? She said, oh, well, you know, in Edenhope when it got too much and we got told about it. She then told me that she and her husband, who was a policeman at the time, had helped move Gerald quietly out of Edenhope. I reacted harshly towards my aunt, as Gerald had been abusing me at that time. My older sister was standing next to me. My aunt was very surprised at my reaction and became upset. After this interaction, I was left standing in the hallway alone, being ignored. Everyone was talking to each other about how hard it was on them. I suddenly put my hand up and said, excuse me, everyone, I was the one fucking raped. I don't know if they heard me. I then walked out. I confronted my uncle, who had been a policeman, about his involvement in moving Gerald from Edenhope. He categorically denied involvement. Other family members were told I was lying about what my aunt had said at the funeral until my sister reminded them that she was there and had heard it. This same uncle then tried to excuse my aunt by saying she was not mentally well and had had a breakdown and had made up the comment. She was admitted to a clinic for treatment. I've since found out that when Gerald was moved out of Edenhope, the same aunt had a conversation with another aunt about suspicion of Gerald's inappropriate behaviour. From that day onwards, none of their children were allowed to be alone with Gerald. They both appeared to have known at the time about Gerald's behaviour, but chose not to warn their siblings and the rest of the family. There's a small spelling mistake in this next line. I have been asked when the abuse stopped, but my response is that it has never stopped. What Gerald did was the result of a pathetic man unable to make correct choices. The combative approach from the church and their efforts to paint me as a liar were just as painful to my life as the abuse itself. Discovering that the church leaders were aware of his abuse of others has shattered my trust in social institutions. The impact of my abuse has been a complete invasion of every aspect of my life. The upbringing I received in the church ensured my naivety was so great I was unaware of what Gerald was doing to me. My fear of being different and a sinner in the eyes of the church meant I was sure it was me doing something wrong. My personal sexual journey was completely disrupted and poisoned by the actions of Gerald. My inability to trust anyone enough to tell them was a result of the church dogma and supernatural regard of its leaders. When I told my father this, he agreed and said that sadly I was probably correct, and at the time no one would have believed me. It is hard to contemplate the dark space I was in during my teenage years. It's actually really difficult to even remember that disturbing time. I lived in terror of turning into Gerald, and the continuing conflict inside of me ensured that relationships were difficult to maintain. Trust of others was non-existent. That's sort of been changed. The worst part after the trials was meeting other victims of Gerald at an event organised by Broken Rights. Name tags were provided, and of course I'm the only one to share his name, making it difficult to interact because I would be judged on my last name. But many of us were able to start putting our stories together, and we quickly realised that on the same day, Gerald would abuse one of us in the morning, another in the afternoon, and a third in the evening. And the reason we know was because public holidays when we met. I've spoken to a couple of victims about the games he'd play, how he'd say, "You're my special one." One boy told me he was jealous of me, and in turn, I felt dumped when another boy came along. I could not even contemplate this perversity back then. I now suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and a number of ongoing interpersonal problems. I am not receiving any support at the moment, but last year I did a PTSD support program in England where I now reside at my own expense. It was extremely good, but it too opened up a lot of wounds. The goal isn't suppression, it's management. I need further and ongoing PTSD support. I have become very good at fronting the world with a strong persona, but you only have to ask those close to me how much this affects me. I am very cautious and selective of who I let in my inner world. I am lucky I have people I can share the pain with no judgment. When I tried to get help from the Catholic Church, my calls for help were ignored. I got the impression the Church was more concerned with protecting their institutional structure than actually listening to me. I was asked to sign a confidentiality agreement when I received money from the Church. This made me feel the Church was offering to buy my silence. I decided to tell the truth no matter what. I have lost a great deal every time I've gone public, but I know my actions. I know my actions in 1993 and beyond have helped in a small way to lead to this Royal Commission, and for that I am extremely grateful.
Anyone else have any questions? Mr Gray, I need to say the same to you about the allegations in relation to Cardinal Pell, as I said to you before lunch. Do you understand?
Yes, Your Honour. I thank you for that reminder. Our position, as I said, is that I explained yesterday that the stance my clients were taking to this hearing would be that in general we would not question witnesses whose task is difficult enough as it is. In the case of the telephone conversation about which Mr Ridsdale has given evidence, the Commission is aware that the Cardinal has publicly and repeatedly said that his recollection of that conversation is quite different. If and when the Commission asks the Cardinal to provide a statement, which we assume will happen, I expect that he will say the same thing.
Well, two things about that. Yes, we will ask, but as you appreciate, you could have the Cardinal make a statement yourselves. It's a matter for you, but he will be asked. But there should be no misunderstanding, merely because of the stance which the Church has otherwise taken. When it comes to issues of the Church's response, or individuals in the Church response to abuse, they are factual matters that we must investigate and determine.
We understand that, Your Honour, and we will approach it in the way that I have mentioned.
Thank you. Yes.
Can I make a comment on that? Is that possible?
Maybe better not to, I think, Mr Ridsdale.
Oh, just the Commission itself I wanted to, just actually a positive one on the Commission.
Well, I don't want you to traverse the
I
controversy.
I won't go across into that area. Just it's actually about the experience of doing this.
Yes, that's fine. You can say what you want to say about that.
Yeah, this has been an extraordinary experience from the point of view of in 93 and in 2001 there was no support, and as I was one of the first, I bore the brunt of the Church's reaction, and so I am extremely pleased to see how far we've come, and hearing the other men's stories has triggered an enormous amount of flashbacks and memories, things like I'd forgotten about being made to sleep at Fitzgerald. I'd forgotten about standing in my parents' roof wanting to jump off but being afraid that I'd only hurt myself and get in trouble. So I'm so pleased, and I hope that the Commission can take it further and remember that there is a lot of young people out there in an extremely dark place in their teen years suffering from being abused, and we now know from research that the earlier we get to those people, the less chance they will hurt themselves and those around them. So I would hope that some process is put into place where young people are allowed to speak about their dark thoughts, to come to terms with them, and that somehow the Commission is able to point out to the Church that their stance on sexuality and gender is completely out of line with modern research, modern thought, and they are out of step with the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Ridsdale. Thank you for your evidence. You are now formally excused.
Thank you very much.
Your Honour, I call Helen Watson.
Ms Watson, would you take an oath on the Bible or an affirmation?
Affirmation, please.
Affirmation.
Yep.
Would you repeat after me? I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give in this Royal Commission
that the evidence I shall give in this Royal Commission
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat, please.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms Vanette.
Your Honour.
Before I read my statement out, I've got a request of the Chair. This report is reasonably concise and I might find it a bit emotional. So my son can read, if that's okay.
That's fine. That's fine.
Right. Thank you.
Just pour yourself a glass of water, Ms Watson.
The reason I'm making this statement today is I'm pursuing truth and justice for my son Peter.
Perhaps we can start at the beginning. If you just pour yourself some water and settle in.
Yep. That okay?
Now, your name?
My name is Helen Watson, Helen Margaret Watson.
And Ms Watson, you made a statement to the Royal Commission on the 28th of April. And you've made some minor amendments today, which you will read when you read your statement.
I will.
Thank you. Now, I invite you to read your statement, and perhaps if you could tell us your son's name.
Michael Watson.
And perhaps Michael can take over if you would like, and I'm also happy if both of you find it difficult.
If I can read the statement independently, I'd love to.
That's good. Thank you. Now, the contents of your statement are true and correct?
It'll be Exhibit 2816.
Please read your statement, Ms Watson.
This statement made by me accurately sets out the evidence that I am prepared to give to the Royal Commission into institutionalised responses to child sexual abuse. The statement is true and correct to the best of my knowledge and belief. My full name is Helen Margaret Watson. I was born in 1949. I'm currently 66 years of age. My family. My family was very committed to the Catholic Church. I was raised to respect God and the Church. I was educated in Catholic primary and secondary schools and totally committed to my faith. My family and I lived and breathed Catholic religion. In 1972, I married Tim Watson from 1972 to about 1997. We lived on a farm in the small rural community of Tatyoon with our two sons, Peter and Michael. Our family travelled 40 kilometres to attend Mass at the Immaculate Conception Church in Arad every Sunday. The boys grew up with the values of the Catholic faith, and Peter was an altar boy. That was an era I did have. Peter and Michael were altar boys, but Michael was not an altar boy. My son Peter went to Yellowwood. That was an era I did have. Peter and Michael were altar boys, but Michael was not an altar boy. Peter had a happy childhood and enjoyed playing football, cricket and basketball for the local community. He aspired to be a high achiever in all that he did. After primary school, Peter went to Marion College, which was right near the Ararat Presbytery. In about 1991, when I was volunteering in the canteen at Marion College, for some reason I had to go to the presbytery with a nun. I think her name was Sister Maria, to collect some supplies for the canteen. The presbytery was next to the church, which was next to the college. I remember that Father Paul David Ryan answered the door. He was reeking of alcohol. From this point onwards, I will refer to him as Ryan, as I hold no respect for that man. This was the first time I met Ryan. I became aware that he was relieving Father Brendan Davey, who was the permanent parish priest in Ararat at that time. Sleep over at the presbytery. In 1991, no, I can't read this.
Okay. In 1991, when Peter was 16, Ryan invited him and some other boys to the presbytery one night. Okay. In 1991, when Peter was 16, at the time I felt honoured and proud that Peter was invited to stay at the presbytery, so I agreed without hesitation. The Sunday morning after the sleepover, Ryan brought Peter back home. I remember the day well, but not the date. I asked Ryan to come in and have some breakfast. He told me he had to go back and say Mass, which blew me away because he reeked of alcohol. After Ryan left, Peter went straight down to his room. Sometime later, I was standing at the kitchen sink and I looked out to see Peter in the paddock, probably 500 metres away. He was physically lifting logs that I did not believe any man could lift. He was building a bonfire. I wondered what was going on, so I went up to him to speak to him. Tears were rolling down his face, and he just said, "Go away, Mum. Go away, Mum." I'll keep going.
So I did.
Oh, righto. You want me to keep going? Or?
No, right. Thank you. From that day onwards, Peter was different and his behaviour changed. He withdrew into his room and became antisocial. He became very troubled and started engaging in self-destructive behaviours, such as self-mutilation, drinking alcohol and then using drugs later. One day at school, Peter kicked down an ornate wooden staircase banister. Another time, Peter grabbed the bus driver around the throat while the bus driver was driving the bus. This kind of behaviour was really out of character. I didn't know what was wrong at the time. I thought it might just have been adolescence, as Peter was the eldest of the two boys. Remarkably, Peter completed schooling. He struggled, but he was quite an intelligent young lad. After Peter left school, he just became transient. He left home and went to university for a year, and he worked part-time at a place called Nuts and Bolts in Altona. But soon he moved from place to place, lost touch with all his lifelong family and friends, and returned home only sporadically. He tried to work, but he was restless and unsettled and found it difficult to maintain employment. Peter discloses the abuse. One day in 1996, when Peter was 21, Peter and I were driving from Tullamarine Airport to the farm. During this trip, Peter told me that he had been sexually abused by a priest. He didn't say who the priest was at that time. Then he told me if I told anyone about this, he would kill himself. I did not raise the subject again while we drove home. Afterwards, I was torn between wanting to breach Peter's trust in me by confronting the church about the sexual abuse and not wanting Peter to take his life. That night, my husband and I found Peter in bed with a loaded shotgun. This was Peter's first suicide attempt that I knew of. That night, we took Peter to a psychiatric ward in Ballarat. After this, Peter needed frequent intervention from psychiatric services. He started seeing a psychologist in Ballarat, her name Kathleen O'Callaghan, about the abuse. In 1997, my marriage with Tim broke down. Tim stayed on the farm and I moved to Ararat. Peter lived between my house and the farm. In 1997, my marriage with Tim broke down. Tim stayed on the farm and I moved to Ararat. He was also on marijuana and attempted to take his life on numerous occasions. There was a 2-week period when Tim drove Peter to counselling sessions with Kathleen O'Callaghan in Ballarat every day. I saw Tim struggle with the knowledge of what had happened to Peter.
During this time, I was continually told by Peter's therapists that he had a predisposition to drugs and suffered from drug-induced psychosis. However, from living with Peter, I suspected that he had schizophrenia.
Peter eventually told me that Ryan was the priest who had sexually abused him. He told me that when he went to the presbytery with Ryan and 5 or 6 other boys, Ryan gave the boys alcohol. They watched blue movies and then all played the card game Strip Jack and ran around naked. Later that evening, the other boys went home, leaving Peter and Ryan alone in the presbytery. Ryan was naked and ran a bath for Peter. He sexually abused Peter. I don't want to talk about that in detail. It's too horrible. And then they slept in the same bed until the following morning. Father Brendan Davey later told me that P used to get off the bus on his way to school and smoke with Ryan at the presbytery. He also said that Peter and other boys used to go to the presbytery at lunch times for a smoke with Ryan. Peter goes missing. On the 18th of March 1999, Peter went to the Grampians where he thought about cutting off his penis and throwing himself over a cliff. This was so that he didn't disgrace his parents. He didn't. Instead, he went to his aunt's house and she told him he needed help and that he should go to psychiatric hospital. Peter then went and was admitted to the Grampian psychiatric unit in Ballarat. There he was involuntarily committed. The hospital rang me to tell me that he had been committed. They also said that Peter had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and other mental health conditions. When I heard this, I thought, oh, thank God. I had fought for years to get that diagnosis. 10 or 15 minutes later, the hospital rang me back and said that Peter had absconded. They told me that he had asked to move his car, which was parked outside the hospital. He had tried to leave in his car. When it didn't start, he got out and he smashed it up. Then he ran away. Peter did not contact me after this. As a mother, I knew that he had come to some grief because he almost always contacted me when he was at his lowest. After Peter went missing, in desperation, I went to the Ararat Presbytery to report the sexually abused by Ryan and to seek help. I haven't got an idea of the date. I do remember clearly speaking to a nun. I cannot remember her name. I was crying and I was out of control crying. The nun said, well, you know, you're clearly not coping. We'll organise some counselling for you. The church organised counselling in Ballarat for me and I went to the St John of God's Hospital where I had the counselling. I remember having a counselling session there and I think I went back for another session. Soon after, the parish priest at that time, Father Brendan Davey, visited me at my home in Ararat. He apologised for the abuse and said that he had no idea that it had happened. He also said that although there was something different about Ryan, he would not have thought that he was a sex offender. He didn't say what was different about Ryan. He didn't say what was different about Ryan. Father Davey told me that he was not in the parish when Ryan abused Peter. Sometime later, this was another change. I wasn't quite sure about the date, and that was another change. Sometime later, I called Ballarat Police and spoke with a detective, Paul Manane. It was a pretty short conversation, but I told him my son's name and that he had been sexually abused by Father Paul David Ryan in Ararat Parish when he was a teenager. I told him Peter had gone missing. Detective Manane said, I'll follow it up. I didn't hear back from Detective Manane. I never followed it up myself because my life at that time was hell. I had to find Peter. The police were the least of my worries. After my contact with the church in 1999, I spent the next 6 years looking for Peter. I was beside myself, and finding my son was my top priority. And you can go.
I hoped that he would be alive, but I sort of knew that he would be dead. It's heartbreaking because I just knew that he had come to grief. I was in survival mode. During this time, the police contacted me from time to time because they had found bodies. I had to go in twice and make a statement. Neither of these bodies were Peter. Peter's body is found. In December 2005, Senior Detective Constable John Jess from Ballarat Police visited me at home to tell me that Peter's body had been identified by a remarkable fingerprint match. I later learnt that on the 20th of October 1999, a woman had walked past a boat shed in Aspendale, Victoria, and smelled something. She got her husband, and they looked in the shed and they saw a body hanging in there. The body was naked and painted blue. We didn't know until much later that that body was Peter.
A police officer investigated and concluded that it was death by suicide and that the suicide had happened in about June of that year. The body was decomposed and could not be identified, but a partial fingerprint was taken from a paint tin that was in the shed. A series of missing person bulletins was published, but only in the Aspendale metropolitan area. The connection with Peter's disappearance wasn't made because the bulletins didn't come to Ballarat. Peter's body was not identified, and after a coronial inquest, he was buried as an unknown person in the Melbourne necropolis. About 6 years later, in 2005, the police officer in charge of the initial investigation in Aspendale, Senior Sergeant Rod Owen, was learning how to use new fingerprint identification technology from the United States. He tested the fingerprints of the unknown body with other prints on record, and Peter's fingerprints came up as a match. He told me that he had always been troubled about the unidentified body in Aspendale. He felt he must have had a family somewhere. When the police told me they had found Peter's body, I was sceptical at first because there had been so many wrong hits over the years. Once it was confirmed, we had to fight to have Peter's body exhumed. We couldn't exhume the body without a death certificate, and we had to go to another coronial inquest to get a death certificate. I felt like we had to fight every step of the way. Eventually, we had Peter's body exhumed, and he was respectfully buried in the community cemetery close to the family home at Taddew. The dice response. After Peter's body had been identified, I approached the Ballarat Diocese again. I met with Peter Bishop Connors on the 21st of February in 2006. During this meeting, I told him that Ryan had sexually abused Peter. A friend of mine was with me at this meeting. Bishop Connors responded in a muffled, monotone voice, "Not him again." I asked for a letter of apology and for the church to cover the costs of Peter's burial in December 2005. I also told Bishop Connors that I wanted every bit of information he had on Ryan. He went over to the filing cabinet and shuffled around for a bit. He then told me that every bit of information he had on Ryan. He went over to the filing contacted by Colin Ryan, who at that time was a detective in the Warrnambool, and he was investigating Ryan in relation to a complaint of child sexual abuse. Detective Ryan is now the Mayor of Moyne Shire. I told him about my visit to Bishop Connors and that he had said there were no documents. I understand that Detective Ryan applied for a search warrant and got documents from the diocese relating to Father Ryan. Father Ryan was later convicted of child sexual abuse offences against other boys. On the 3rd of March 2006, I met with Bishop Connors again. I asked for counselling, which Bishop Connors agreed to. I insisted that I go to a counsellor of my choice, and Bishop Connors agreed. Between March and May 2006, the church paid for me to go to 15 sessions of counselling. On the 20th of March 2006, Bishop Connors wrote to me and offered, as a matter of pastoral concern, to provide financial assistance to cover the cost of Peter's burial. In this letter, Bishop Connors also acknowledged and apologised for Ryan's abuse of Peter. In June 2006, the church gave, in this letter, Bishop Connors also acknowledged and apologised for Ryan's abuse of Peter, burial expenses and the cost of exhuming Peter's body. On the 7th of June 2006, I met with Bishop Connors and asked for compensation from the church for the sexual abuse of Peter and its impact on me. Counselling did not seem to be working and I was desperate to get help for myself. Bishop Connors told me that he was sorry about my son and that I may never get my faith back, but the church had no money and I needed to take some responsibility for my own healing. I was shattered. I remember leaving the building in a highly emotional state. I felt as though the church did not care about me, my struggle, nor the sexual abuse of Peter or the loss of my son. During 2008 and 2009, my counsellor contacted the diocese. My counsellor at that time contacted the diocese and asked them to pay for further counselling sessions for me. The diocese agreed and approved counselling sessions in batches of 5 to 15 sessions in May 2009. there's a new sentence, sorry. In May 2009, I met with Bishop Connors again and he agreed to fund 10 more counselling sessions. After this, I did not approach the church again until 2013, when Bishop Paul Bird was on board. I first met with Bishop Bird on the 3rd of December 2013. During this meeting, I told him that I wanted recognition and compensation for my pain and suffering and counselling. We agreed that I would arrange a further meeting with Bishop Bird to discuss compensation. On 18th of December 2013, I met again with Bishop Bird. He suggested that we try and resolve the issue of compensation through mediation. On the 11th of February 2014, I participated in mediation with Bishop Bird and mediator Greg Rooney. He was from South Australia. We had a morning session where I spoke about how I was feeling. I said that in my opinion the church had minimised everything that had happened and that all they did was offer counselling. In the afternoon session, Bishop Bird said, "Now I want you to tell me how we can help you to heal." And I said, at this mediation, I said, "I want to take 6 months off work to write a book because it is very therapeutic to record thoughts, feelings and experiences. I definitely need counselling, and the way I'm feeling now, it might be for 10 years. And because I struggle with depression and anxiety, maybe some Tai Chi. I believe that would be helpful." And he said yes. The outcome of the mediation was amazing for me. It was a really good mediation. In earlier meetings with Bishop Bird, I felt that he had been defensive and he was totally different in the mediation. He told me that he had never realised the seriousness of the situation or what I had been through. At the mediation, it appeared to me that he had tears rolling down his face. He said, "I'm sorry about all this." I thought, oh well, that is an apology. I walked away from the mediation feeling okay. I thought, I can now get my life back. I'm going to be okay. At the end of the mediation, Bishop Bird said, "I'll get the church's solicitor to contact your lawyer." I gave Bishop Bird the name of my lawyer. I understood the lawyers would talk about the amounts of compensation we had discussed during the mediation. I contacted my lawyer, Graham Hills, from Hines and Partners, about a week after the mediation. He told me he had not been contacted by the diocese or by their lawyers. In April or March 2014, my solicitor, Mr Hills, contacted the church's lawyers to advise them of my intention to make a civil claim against the Catholic Church. We hadn't heard from the church's lawyers after the mediation. I felt I had to go down the civil path now because nothing came out of the mediation. I just couldn't walk away. Over the following months, I had 3 psychiatric assessments. On the 4th of December 2014, Mr Hills, my barrister, Mr Hills, my lawyer, my barrister, Mr Tim Seacole, and I met with Patrick Monaghan, who I understood was the diocese lawyer. Hills, my lawyer, my barrister, Mr Tim Seacole, and I met with the lawyer. I don't know whether that was the right or the wrong thing to do. The diocese offered me $40,000 in compensation and said this was because I had already been given about $11,000. They had it right down to the very last cent. It wasn't just $11,000. It would have been $11,672.21. It was just so petty. I couldn't believe they could be so horrible like that. I had already been given about $11,000 for counselling and for the cost of Peter's burial. My niece, who came to the mediation as a support person, told me not to accept this offer because that amount would not even cover my counselling. This was also agreed to by my 2 legal reps. There was no settlement at that mediation. My civil claim is still unresolved. Police investigation. In 2013, I gave evidence at the Victorian inquiry into the handling of child abuse by religious and other organisations. As a result of this inquiry, a police officer was assigned to properly investigate what happened to Peter, including his death. I was very, very happy with this outcome. This is another difference here. My husband, Tim, spoke to Detective Senior Constable David Ray from Sano Task Force, who was working on our case. As a result, in April 2014, Tim and I both made statements to the police about Peter's abuse by Ryan. However, we know that Ryan can't be prosecuted for his abuse of Peter because Peter is deceased and there is no hard evidence. That's what we've been told by Sano anyhow. Last year, my son Michael and I went to see Father Brendan Davey. My son asked Father Davey whether he thought Ryan had abused Peter. He paused for a minute and then he said yes. When we asked why, he thought that Father Davey said it was because Detective Manane had told him. I also went to St John of God's Hospital and there was no record of me going to counselling there either. Impact on my life and my family. While Peter was alive, I struggled daily, supporting him and watching him. No, I can't read this.
While Peter was alive, I struggled daily, supporting and watching him struggle with life after the sexual abuse. I watched his life spiral out of control. Peter had been an intelligent, gentle, fun-loving and beautiful soul. He was respected by all who knew him. After the abuse, he felt worthless, lacked motivation, had low self-esteem with bouts of depression. Peter's tragic journey following the sexual abuse started with escalating antisocial behaviours. Our family became fractured due to Peter's journey of self-destruction, and my marriage with Tim broke down. I started gambling and drinking alcohol. I threw myself into my work because I didn't want to think about what happened. Work, gambling and drinking were my coping mechanisms. I have had feelings of tremendous guilt that I couldn't protect my son. Peter was adopted and I've tried to contact his birth mother, but I haven't been able to. I feel I've let her down. I continue to experience a great sense of loss. I've lost my son, my family, my faith, my happiness. I've endured this struggle for the last 20 years because of the sexual abuse of my son by Ryan.
Apart from the tragedy of what happened to my family, the events also had an impact on my faith. I have lost my faith, which was historically a huge part of my life. I have also lost my trust in the Catholic Church because I felt that it protected the offender but did nothing to protect the victims. I still hold that view today. I feel like I am stuck in this system where the Catholic Church has absolute total control. What do? Do I walk away? I can't walk away because I'm not healed and there has been no justice for Peter. I retired in October 2014. I had a good working career, but when I retired, the reality of life hit me big time. I am now receiving counselling from Amanda Commons Trelaw, and it is the first time that counselling is actually working and has ever been really successful. My recommendations. I believe that Ryan and the Catholic Church destroyed my son. I think that the beliefs of his Catholic education in the Church and our family values, all instilled in him since childhood, prevented him from reporting the abuse. Peter never said anything against Ryan, even after he disclosed the abuse of Ryan to me. I think survivors and secondary victims of child sexual abuse by Catholic clergy should receive financial compensation, and that the amount offered should be determined by legislation so that it is not a decision made wholly by the Catholic Church. I also think the Catholic Church should finance unlimited access to counselling for all primary and secondary victims. I would like to see a system where victims of child sexual abuse by Catholic clergy and their families can receive help independent from but funded by the Catholic Church. For instance, I think survivors should have some form of a card that enables them to access help, such as counselling and medical services, without having to go to the church for help. Every week I go to counselling. Afterwards, I have to go to the DICE office to get reimbursement. It hurts me every time. I have to go back to the church. It hurts me every time I have to go back to the church. I know I need to get the Catholic Church out of my life, yet they are paying for my counselling. Survivors and their families need independence from the Catholic Church.
would just like to make a few more closing statements. Your Honour.
I would like the record to show that I endorse all the recommendations of the previous witnesses at this Royal Commission in Ballarat. I would like to thank the Royal Commission for the opportunity to make my statement today. I make a special thank you to all the compassionate and caring support staff of the Royal Commission. I have no doubt in my mind that I can't read this bit.
I have no doubt in my mind that I will take my unresolved trauma and grief caused by the sexual abuse of our Peter by Ryan and the horrendous cover of the church hierarchy to my grave.
Thank you.
Your Honour, just one matter. When Ms Watson completed her statement, she referred in two paragraphs, 31 and 63, to an inspector, Detective Inspector Murnane. That statement was provided to him and he's provided a response which has been given to Ms Watson by her solicitors.
Yep.
And as a result she amended paragraph 31 in the manner she indicated. The original statement had in 1999 and it was amended to
Yeah, it was the date that I wasn't quite sure, but I would have thought that the LEAP database would have that recorded.
I tender a email from the detective setting out his response to those two paragraphs, and copies are available. There will need to be some redactions done before it's made publicly available.
So this is an email from?
Paul Murnane.
Make it Exhibit 2817.
Thank you, Ron. I have no questions of the witness.
Do we have anything from Detective Ryan?
No.
Who Ms Watson referred to, we'll need to talk about that.
The witness.
Do we have anything from Detective Ryan? I just need to say the same thing, Mr Gray, in relation to Bishop Connors and Bishop Bird.
Yes, Your Honour, and as I've said, the approach that my clients have taken is an approach that applies to all witnesses.
It's a matter for you and for your client, but I need to say this to you each time, lest there be any misunderstanding in relation to what the Commission may do by way of making findings.
Yes, I'm just observing, Your Honour, that the same issue did arise a number of times yesterday before Your Honour raised it with me today, and the same approach applies. That is, that my clients have taken the view that they do not wish to add to the distress of the witnesses in this hearing where it's difficult enough, and that where necessary, as in some places it plainly is, the people in question, whether it be Bishop Connors or anyone else, will make their response known. My clients, Your Honour, as the Commission would be aware, have had these statements from the witnesses only since about late last week.
Mr Gray, you've had them for time enough to have sought instructions, but those instructing you should... Mr Gray, you've had them for time enough to have sought it, that the Church has adopted the stance which it has.
No,
it's not relevant to any finding which we may be asked to make or indeed make.
I do understand that, Your Honour, but the only observation I would make is that my clients trust in good faith and without any doubt that the Commission would not make findings against anyone, whether it be a church person or anyone else, without giving that person the opportunity to be heard.
Well, that's precisely why I'm raising this with you now.
No, I'm talking about a statement.
Well, no, if a statement is one thing,
yes,
but if you want to challenge, or those who instruct you want to challenge what a witness says on a particular issue, that is another thing.
It is. Your Honour, I'm sorry to be taking the time, but the practice guideline requires us to challenge someone where it is to be submitted that that person is not to be believed or has been deliberately untruthful. I do not expect to be making any such submission in relation to any of the witnesses who have given evidence.
Well, the consequence which will flow from that, in the most likely event, is the witness will be believed, and that will found a finding.
Well, it will. I don't want to traverse that, Your Honour, but there will be other evidence one expects, which no doubt the Commission will consider, but I don't seek to say any more about it.
Well, Mr Gray, I'm sure you understand what I'm saying. I'm sure those instructing you do. There must be no misunderstanding about this. These are significant and serious questions as to the way your client has responded to the allegations. That's what it comes down to, and they are issues which we will have to determine having regard to the evidence before us. But if the proposition from your client is that all of these witnesses should be believed, you can appreciate that it's likely that it might be said in relation to evidence that you might bring by others, it might be submitted that they shouldn't be believed. Now, that's a matter for you and your clients.
The submission that I have anticipated, Your Honour, is not that they should be believed if their evidence is different from something that somebody from one of my clients ultimately says. The submission, what I'm observing at the moment is that I do not have instructions at the moment, and don't expect to have them, to challenge any of these witnesses on the basis that they are being deliberately untruthful.
Well, I've said enough, I think.
Yes, Your Honour.
Yes, thank you, Ms Watson. Sorry to delay you, but thank you for your statement, and your son. I need to say that you are excused.
Your Honour, I wish to call Peter Blenkind. I note the time. Would it be possible perhaps to extend the sitting day, as long as those who are doing a lot of the hard work will find it manageable, in order to complete his evidence?
I'm not mindful of how long his statement is. How long is it?
About 14 pages.
I think we might take a 10-minute break.
Certainly.
If we're going to extend so that those who are working very hard in front of us can have a little bit of respite. So we'll adjourn just for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Your Honour.